to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
As we continue our examination into who wrote the Gospel books, let's quickly summarize what we've seen so far. The Gospel books were written by Matthew the Apostle, Mark, who was writing the Apostle Peter's testimony, Luke, the Gentile companion of Paul, and John the Apostle and closest personal friend of Jesus. These authorships were not challenged for 1,500 years until the era of the Enlightenment, with its ethos to drive God out of society, which required discrediting Christianity, which in turn necessitated discarding the gospel books. We couldn't have them to be eyewitness testimony, so they were arbitrarily proclaimed to have been anonymous. There was no evidence for this claim, but scholarly prestige caused the view to become widely accepted. And in 1936, a scholar named Colin Roberts found in the British Museum an old, tiny fragment of a papyrus manuscript. And it had been in the library for quite a while, but nobody bothered to look at and see what it was. And he realized, so he read the letters, and he realized this was from the Gospel according to John. Not a big piece, just a little fragment, but enough that you could know what it was. And this fragment, he dated to the year AD 125 or 130. He was essentially pushing it as late as he could. He could have dated it anywhere from 80 to 130. But either way, even at 130, it was 30 years before the earliest possible date that the assured results of critical scholarship had told us. Now, you would think at this point, the credibility of critical scholarship and historical criticism would have collapsed. But it didn't. They just shamelessly kept on. They had to admit, though, that the gospel books all dated into the first century. They dragged kicking and screaming into that admission, but they did finally have to admit it. But they still try to put it as late as possible. They still insisted that these books were written decades after the facts, trying to push it as late as possible in the first century as they could. And they did have a new cutoff. They did have a date before which they refused to go. And that was to say that the earliest gospel book was written in the year 70. Eventually, they were willing to perhaps go back as far as 66.
It's very interesting. It's, listening to what you've said here, they're essentially basing their hypothesis on speculation, just so that they can push the gospel dates much later than the actual evidence. But you talked about now they're willing to move their date forward, and now it's actually quite a lot. Now it's over at 70 or 66. Why those dates now?
Yes, there's a very good book actually written by a now deceased scholar named Dr. Ada Lideman. She was a leading liberal scholar from Tübingen. She wrote a lot of books on this, and then she became a Christian, and she renounced all the nonsense she'd been spouting earlier, and she wrote a number of books on this. One of them, very, very good, it's called Historical Criticism, Methodology or Ideology, Reflections of a Bultmannian turned Evangelical, published by Baker Books in 1990, translated by Robert W. Yarbrough. And she really does a good job of blowing the whistle on how liberal scholarship works and how it elevates speculation into consensus and assured results without any kind of real evidence at all, particularly chapter 9 of the book. It's well worth reading. As far as the dates, they were forced in the first century by manuscript discoveries. The manuscripts forced them to admit it, and they would move it back in the first century, but not before AD 70 or AD 66. Why is that? Why did that become the new cutoff date? It's because of a prophecy Jesus made. It's recorded in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, Matthew 24, verses 1 to 2. And we read in Mark, then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." It's a strange little idea of why would every single stone of the temple be torn apart. But he did make that prophecy, and history tells us that it was fulfilled exactly. When the Jews rose up in rebellion against their Roman overlords, led to a very nasty war that went on for 4 years and ended with the Romans taking Jerusalem, destroying the city, killing many, many people, and destroying the temple to the point that every single stone was pulled off of every single stone, not one left. Well, if that's the case, then Jesus genuinely told a prophecy. If this was written before the date of fulfillment, what to the liberal scholars, it can't be. It cannot possibly have been a predictive prophecy because remember, supernatural is impossible. So they will say that any book that has this prophecy of Jesus in it had to have been written after the fact. And that's why for a long time, that cutoff point was AD 70. They're willing to go back as far as 66 now to when the war actually broke out, because they would say, well, okay, a clever person could figure out that the Romans are going to trash the city. So, but that's as far back as they're willing to go. Nothing that would allow for supernatural.
But could they also argue though it wasn't necessarily fulfilled exactly because I've seen pictures of, I think they call it the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, where there are many Jews gather to pray, and it's very interesting. They stick these little papers into some of the spots, the opening there. Isn't that part of the temple? I mean, that wasn't thrown down, right? So was Jesus wrong?
Actually, no. That the Wailing Wall was never actually part of the temple. It was part of one of the retaining walls. When King Herod embarked on these major building projects, including expanding and beautifying the temple. The temple is on top of Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, which obviously like a hill, is curved at the edges. And as he wanted to expand the temple, he needed more flat land. So what he had was retaining walls put around the hill and filled in with dirt to allow for more of a flat area and allow for the expansion of the temple. That Wailing Wall is actually the remnants of one of these retaining walls. None of the temple is left, not one stone upon another.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I think if we have the time, perhaps we can talk a little bit about what happened to that temple site, because I think there's actually another building there now. But anyways, so going back to the prophecy, Jesus was correct. He made a prophecy about the destruction of the temple, and it was fulfilled. But what does this have to do with the dates of the gospel books, though?
In reality, it should tell us that they were written before 70, not after. It would be reasonable to assume that if Jesus had foretold this, and the gospel writers are writing after it came to pass, that they would mention that it came to pass just as Jesus said. In Acts chapter 11, you have a prophet named Agabus, minor prophet, mentioned a couple of times in the book of Acts, and that's it. But in chapter 11, he comes to the church at Antioch and foretells a famine that will fall upon the Roman world. And we're told that was fulfilled. And that's what led to this mission of Paul to take relief to the church in Jerusalem. So if the fulfillment of even a minor prophecy like this is recorded, we would expect the fulfillment of a major prophecy like the destruction of the temple to be recorded. And it isn't. So we should actually see that as evidence that these were written before 70. Liberal scholars, of course, do the opposite. As we said, they reject the supernatural. They say Jesus could not have foretold the future, and therefore the books could not be earlier than that.
Yeah, and actually that makes a lot of sense because especially, recently we had an election in the US, and there are always all these people making predictions, and they would include the result of the prediction if they had done it correctly to have it written after. So, but that's a good point. But you did say that they say it could be as early as AD 66. Wouldn't that still make it a supernatural prophecy anyways, because it's still before the actual event?
Well, as I said, from their point of view, no, they would think that while a clever person could see the writing on the wall, so to speak, the Jews have now risen up in revolt. They're bound to defeat. They're too clever by half on this, though, because it still would have a supernatural element to it. It would not be normal for the Romans or any conquering army to knock down every single stone from the temple. That would be an awful lot of work, and it wouldn't be necessary. So even if they're willing to go to 66 and they think we're keeping the supernatural out, they aren't quite keeping it out. There's an element of that prophecy that really couldn't have been seen in 66 even by a smart guy. But that then is how liberal scholars go about things. That's what brings us to this point where scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman tell us that the Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, 35 to 65 years after his death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels were written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. And that, what we've gone over, basically answers our first question. How did we arrive at this situation?
Okay, makes sense. All right, and if I may try to sum it up a little bit, is if I understand this correctly, the desire was to elevate men over God, and that took root in the Enlightenment. Therefore, it required people to discredit the Bible, especially the gospel books, so that nothing supernatural in them can be accepted, because if there are eyewitnesses and they attest to the supernatural, that means they saw it, and that this couldn't have been allowed. So they had to move it out and date it late so that they could deny that these were eyewitnesses and people actually saw these events occurring and recording them. And these claims that the gospel books were written by unknown authors 35 to 65 years after, as Ehrman has said, after the events they describe, is based on their metaphysical bias and not through actual evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's a pretty good summary of the first point. Now, we have said that they're basing it not on any evidence, and that's a charge we're making, so we will revisit that obviously as we continue our points and see the problems and see the lack of evidence and see where the evidence actually takes us. So as we move on to the second point now, recall, okay, we said that the gospel books are the linchpin of the Bible, okay? They tell us the account of the life, the ministry, the deeds, the miracles, and the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, let us set aside for the moment the question of divine authorship. We Christians believe the Bible is God-breathed and the writers were carried along by the Holy Spirit. But let's for the moment set aside that issue and look at the gospel books simply as historical accounts, because they certainly are that. Even skeptics have to concede that these are historical accounts. Well, for historical accounts, the reliability depends fundamentally on whether the authors were people who were in a position to know. Were they in a position to know what they're writing about? And the fact is that applies to all events from ancient history. And mostly now also, eyewitness testimony remains the gold standard in criminal trials. That's what we use there. Now today, of course, we have cameras, we can take pictures and videos, we can fake pictures and videos, but not in the ancient world. In the ancient world, all we really have to pass on accounts of what happened was written documentation.
Okay. So, I guess written documentation sounds nice, but I guess maybe I watched a few too many movies, because isn't the archaeological evidence better? Like the discovery of certain coins or even like these particular letters in their forms or something like that. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Let's continue the next time.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.